So the world has changed a lot, as we've been saying, and it's changing kind of very, very rapidly and very, very recently. So what are the effects of these changes? So we're going to start with a slightly different question, and I'm going to explain it in a second, why it is a slightly different question. So we're not talking now about how screens are affecting children. We're talking about how are children that nowadays different to children of previous generations. I'm going to be explaining there's a really important difference there that I'm going to get to. But what is the data? So how are children nowadays different to children of previous generations? So we don't know back, 10,000 years because we didn't have any way of recording stuff. So pretty much the only data that we have is how children have changed over the course of, the last 100 years or so, which is pretty much the only kind of types of tests that we've been giving consistently have been kind of go back about 100 years. And one of the things that comes from this, the two things that come from this are the two things that are in the title. Yeah. So we're smarter. So what do we mean by that? Okay. So around about 100 years ago, a British, oh my goodness me, I'm blanking on his name. A British psychologist. Oh my goodness me, I'm getting old. Oh, I'm not getting old. I'm getting no sleep because my kids keep me up all night. It will come back to me halfway through the talk. But anyway, British psychologist came up with this idea of giving a whole wide battery of tasks to children and looking at which particular task is how predictive children which particular task is most predictive of how well children do across all the other tasks. Yeah. So he found as a general pattern that generally children who do well at one task tend to do well at most other tasks. Yeah, we now know from more work that it's more complicated than that. There are some children that are particularly good at verbal things, for example, and some things that are particularly good at numbers things, and so on and so on. And there are lots and lots of different subfactors beyond that. But it's also still true as a basic principle that the better that I do at one thing, the better I do at most other tests. Yeah, we call it a general factor of intelligence. Yeah, as well as there are other kind of smaller subfactors. Yeah, and he also found just simply from giving loads and loads of different tests to loads and loads of different children that this one particular test was most predictive of how well children do at all the other tests that comes up. Yeah. And this is what's given rise to what we call an IQ test, so an intelligence quotient test, which is the general factor of intelligence. So we've been giving that to children for kind of tests that are pretty much identical to that to children for around about the last kind of 100 years, kind of about 1910. This guy, whose name I still can't remember, it'll come back to me, started doing this. And it turns out that since we've been giving these tests to children, the performance of those tests has been getting really quite a lot better. Yeah. So this is defined. IQ is defined. Kind of the mean is 100, and the standard deviation is 10. So that's how it's defined. And over the course of the 100 years, we've got about 4 standard deviations faster. And to translate that into meaningful terms, what that means is a child who nowadays was on the 50th centile, so absolutely bang average in your class. If you took that same child and put it back into a childhood classroom when I was a kid, yeah, when I was in school 40 years ago, that same child would be round about between the 70th and the 80th centile. Yeah. So around about 3/4 up in terms of how well they are compared to middle. Yeah. And if I took that same child and put that back into my parents' classroom, my mum's classroom, when she was at school back in the 50s, yeah, that child would be somewhere around about the 90th centile. Yeah. So really, really quite a big kind of year-on-year change in terms of us getting better at these types of tasks, which, as I say, have been designed not by anyone, with a particular aim in mind, but just simply from the point of view of giving lots of tests to see how well we can predict how well children do across all tests. Chloe's got a good question. So I'm not going to go into detail on that, Chloe, about what's the difference between, so that this task that I just showed you is a fluid IQ task. Yeah. And the other ones that have been showing are these other types of things called crystallized IQ. So that's more kind of verbal reasoning, the type of things that they give in, SAT tests, more around things like knowing the definitions of words, and more the types of things that you it's more about, how much you learn. And spatial IQ is about spatial reasoning, and fluid IQ is this kind of pure form of pattern spotting that's there. But we've been getting better at all of these different tasks, as you can see from there. Okay. So that's what leads me to make this statement. We're getting smarter. Yeah. But another thing, which probably most of you have come across, it's something that, I working kind of in mental health research, spend a lot of my time talking about, a lot of my time thinking about. Brazilda, really good question. What's causing that? We're going to be getting onto that in a second. But the other point, I want to start from this idea that's in the title, smarter but more stressed. Yeah. And this idea of more stressed is, again, very, very hard to define and be sure about. Yeah. What we know is that diagnoses of mental health problems, particularly what we call affective disorders, so that's things to do with anxiety and depression. Yeah. Those are the specific types of mental health diagnoses that are going up really quite rapidly over time. Yeah. Obviously, there's been a big spike due to COVID, but even before COVID, they were really going up quite fast year on year. It's very, very hard to be sure. And there's a massive amount of research gone into this question. Is it just because we're diagnosing it more? Is it just because we're more likely to talk about it compared to what we were before? But as far as we can tell, there are some studies that have been giving exactly the same kind of questionnaires to people in the same way we've been giving these exactly the same IQ tests to people over time. Yeah. And these are lists of questions like, how often can I not sleep at night because I'm lying in bed worrying, and so on and so on, which really try to focus on symptoms rather than just how easy it is to get a diagnosis at a given level of severity. And as far as we can tell from those types of studies, we think it's actually symptoms that are going up. Yeah. And as I say, it's not all types of mental health symptoms. It's very specifically these affective disorders. So anxiety and depression. Okay. So that's what starts my kind of starting point for this talk. So we're getting smarter, but we're getting more stressed. But the really, really key point, as Brazil has already said very nicely, is we don't know that this is because of technology. Yeah. And this is an experiment which is massively, massively important for our future as a species. Yeah. But it's very, very hard for us as scientists to be sure about it, because the way you find out what an effect someone has on them is by doing something like a drug trial. Yeah. Where I get a group of people, none of whom have had the drug. I randomly allocate half of them to have the drug and then half of them to have a placebo. So they all think they're having the drug. Yeah. But only half of them are actually having the drug. And then I track them over the time to see how they progress. Yeah. We can't do that with technology for a variety of reasons. Yeah. We can't, find a population who've never had of kids who've never been exposed to technology. We can't give them a placebo, lots and lots of other things that we can't do with that. So it's very, very hard to be sure that these two trends, which, as I say, we're as sure as we can be, are happening. Yeah. It's very hard to be sure that they're due to technology. There's a big debate going on about this. I've read lots about this in the papers recently. This book just came out, a very, very sensationalist book, really arguing very strongly that as you say, the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. And this is a really great article I'd recommend, written by a researcher whose job it is to actually research this, Candace Odgers. So Jonathan Haidt's this isn't his specialist topic. Yeah. He's just got very strong opinions and he's written a book about it. Candace Odgers, it is her job. So she's paid to do research into mental health and kind of conditions and whether they're due to social media. And she points to things like studies that she's done where you look kind of within countries. There have been times when a particular country has banned social media or introduced social media and looked at how the rate of social media, the rate of mental illness has changed in children round about the time when they either ban social media or introduce it. Those are the types of quasi experiments that we can do to try to work out what's actually causing something else. Yeah. And she argues, and in fact, it's the consensus from people working in this field, that it's very hard to get really good evidence that it's social media that's causing things. Yeah, because as Brazilda was saying, sorry, Judy's just done something. I'll get to that in a second. So what else has changed over the past century? I think probably, if there's anything you want to talk about in that, put it in the chat. But I'll probably skip on because I can already see that we're getting a bit behind because there's lots more to get through. But some of the things I was expecting you'll put in the chat with a bit more time were, things like diet has changed massively. Urbanization has changed. 200 years ago, 5% of the world's kids grew up in cities, and we're now at something like 60%. Family structures have changed. Access to kind of printed reading material. So lots and lots of different things have changed over the course of time, as well as technology. And as I say, it's very hard to be sure the kind of what's causing what. Okay.